On October 14, 2014, at 6:30 a.m., a thick, damp fog blanketed the coniferous forests of Discovery Park in Seattle. 29-year-old Stephanie Cooper set out on her usual jog along the route to the coast and vanished without a trace. Search parties and park rangers combed an area within a radius of 20 miles, but found only a slashed fitness tracker, deeply embedded in the cold mud. The eerie silence of the forest swallowed her up, leaving no clues behind. The investigation reached a dead end, and over time, everyone presumed her dead. However, exactly 8 years later, on November 2, 2022, at midnight, thousands of miles from the United States, on the cold asphalt of a train station in the French city of Marseille, a patrol finds a silent, incredibly emaciated woman dressed in shapeless men's clothing. She instinctively flinches in terror at every sound, and deep, old scars from ropes are visible on her wrists. An emergency fingerprint check through the Interpol database yields an impossible result. The prints belong to Stephanie Cooper. How did an American woman who went missing while out for a run end up on another continent? And who exactly stole 8 years of her life, turning it into an endless psychological nightmare? On October 14, 2014, the city of Seattle awoke under a thick blanket of ocean fog. The air temperature was 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and visibility near the coast did not exceed 50 feet. At 6:15 a.m., 29-year-old Stephanie Cooper, a leading financial analyst at a major consulting firm, left her home. She was training for a marathon and strictly adhered to a grueling workout schedule. Her daily route took her to Discovery Park, a wild expanse of coniferous forest on the shore of Puget Sound. The area had a reputation for being safe, but that morning, the eerie silence of the forest concealed something inevitable. According to the police report, at 6:28 a.m., Stephanie's dark blue Subaru Outback slowly pulled into an empty parking spot near the south entrance. A surveillance camera at the ranger station captured the last known footage of the girl. The video footage dispassionately shows her getting out of the car at 6:30 a.m. She was wearing a light gray windbreaker, black athletic leggings, and sneakers with bright neon accents. The girl locked the car, activated her fitness tracker, and set off with a confident stride along the trail marked Loop Trail. This narrow dirt path wound through the thicket and led to rocky slopes near the water. Stephanie finally disappeared from the camera's view at 6:32 a.m. No one ever saw her alive again. The first alarm was raised at 4 p.m. Stephanie, who was known for her meticulousness, failed to show up for a meeting with the board of directors. Her cell phone kept going straight to voicemail. At 6:45 p.m., her younger sister Megan contacted the Seattle Police Department. While filing the report, Megan stated that Stephanie always sent a text message after her run. That day, there was no message. The officer on duty initially followed standard procedure, but after a patrol crew discovered a locked Subaru in a dark parking lot at 8 p.m., the case was given priority status. At 10 p.m., an unprecedented search operation was launched. Within hours, the park had turned into the epicenter of organized chaos. More than 50 volunteers, 4 K-9 units, and 24 armed rangers with specialized equipment began combing through the area, which spanned more than 500 acres. A helicopter equipped with infrared thermal imaging cameras took to the night sky. Over the next 14 days, the teams methodically scanned every yard of the rugged terrain. Slippery shorelines, deep ravines, and nearly impassable fern thickets. Senior investigator David Harris, who led the investigation, ordered the team to focus their efforts on the most dangerous sections of the route, leaning toward the theory of a tragic accident. Search dogs quickly picked up the scent from the car door and confidently led the group along the route. but stopped exactly 1 mile later, circling confusedly on the damp ground. The trail simply vanished, as if the subject of the search had suddenly evaporated into thin air. A chilling breakthrough occurred on the 6th day of the search. On October 19th, at 2:15 p.m., the volunteers stumbled upon their only tangible clue. 2 miles from the parking lot, in a deep, damp ravine where almost no light penetrated through the tree canopy, lay a black silicone fitness tracker. Local rangers had dubbed the spot Blind Turn. It was a narrow section of the trail, squeezed between steep rocky outcrops and the massive roots of ancient trees. This dark location instantly became the ominous embodiment of the entire mystery. The tracker was half buried in cold mud. Detective Harris ordered the perimeter to be cordoned off with double yellow tape. What the forensic experts discovered while examining the device under a microscope completely turned the investigation on its head. The silicone strap had not been torn by hitting rocks or stretched during a struggle. It had been cut. The perfectly smooth, surgically precise cut indicated the use of an extremely sharp blade. Police technicians sifted through every inch of soil at Blind Turn within a 50-foot radius. The result shocked even seasoned investigators. There were absolutely no signs of a struggle at the scene. Not a single broken branch, no foreign shoe print, and not a microscopic drop of the attacker's blood. Data downloaded from the tracker showed that Stephanie's heart rate remained completely stable until the device stopped recording at 7:12 a.m. The graph showed no sudden spike in heart rate, characteristic of panic or a sudden attack. She saw no threat until the very last second. Detective Harris personally interviewed the 3 tourists who had been in the park that foggy morning. However, their testimonies yielded no results. An elderly couple walking along the coast at 8 a.m. saw nothing but fog. A young man jogging on a parallel path told investigators that he heard nothing but the sound of the waves. No unregistered vehicles were captured on camera at the park's exit. The case was completely at a standstill. The woman had vanished into the cold air, leaving nothing behind. But the clean cut on the tracker's strap wouldn't let the forensic experts rest. It silently but convincingly proved one thing. Someone had thoroughly studied this forest. Someone had been waiting for her right at the Blind Turn, where the cameras don't work. And this unknown assailant took her so swiftly and flawlessly silently that the police realized the horrific reality. They were not dealing with a search for a missing person, but with the invisible trail of a perfect predator who had just begun his game. For 8 long years, the case remained at a standstill. Hope of finding the girl alive had faded, and the thick cardboard volume containing the investigation files had gathered dust in the basements of the police headquarters. However, on November 2, 2022, a routine night patrol was interrupted by an event that forced law enforcement agencies in 2 countries to work in emergency mode, rewriting all the rules of criminal investigation. That autumn night, the city of Marseille was greeted by a biting, damp wind. It was 11:45 p.m. The Gare de Marseille-Saint-Charles train station had almost completely emptied out. Just then, 2 local patrol officers were conducting their standard rounds of the station's outer perimeter. According to their official report, near a massive stone structure that locals call the North Arch, they noticed a strange figure. This arch, always dark and damp due to endless drafts, would later become, in police reports, an ominous symbol of a person's return from oblivion. The figure was sitting on the damp concrete, instinctively pressing her back against the rough stone wall of the arch, as if trying to blend in with it. It was a woman, but her appearance shocked the officers. The senior patrol officer's report noted that she resembled a living shadow. The woman was clad in shapeless, dirty men's clothing, a faded jacket and worn-out size 10 work boots that were several sizes too large. She was barely breathing, trembling constantly, and flinching in terror at any sudden noise, whether it was a distant train whistle or the footsteps of police officers on the asphalt. According to witnesses, she responded to all attempts by the patrol officers to speak to her only with panicked silence. Her gaze was completely vacant and fixed rigidly on an invisible point somewhere in the darkness. At 12:15 a.m., an ambulance rushed the unidentified woman to the intensive care unit at Timon Hospital. The on-call doctor's medical report read more like a description of a torture victim than that of a homeless person. The patient weighed barely 85 pounds, indicating a critical degree of physical exhaustion. Her body temperature had dropped to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Doctors diagnosed her with extreme dehydration, a deficiency in essential vitamins, and multiple old bruises. But what concerned the medical staff most were her wrists and ankles. Deep scars were clearly visible on her pale skin. In his report, a trauma expert reconstructed the nature of these injuries. Such characteristic marks result exclusively from prolonged restraint with a stiff rope or metal wire over many months or years. In addition to physical injuries, doctors diagnosed severe psychological shock. The patient was in a state of profound dissociation from reality. She refused to eat, was afraid of bright lights, and hid under her thin bed every time she heard footsteps in the hallway. Since the woman could not utter a single word and had no identification on her, the clinic's administration contacted the Marseille criminal police to establish her identity. At 2:30 a.m. on November 3rd, a forensic expert arrived at the ward with a portable scanner. The fingerprinting procedure proved to be extremely difficult. The patient was afraid of any physical contact and actively resisted until she was administered a sedative. The fingerprint samples obtained were uploaded to the French police database. The search yielded no results. Then, following protocol, the officers expanded the search radius and sent digital copies through Interpol channels to the global international database. At 3:15 a.m., the computer system returned a result that caused the Interpol officer on duty to double-check his monitor screen. The biometric match was 100%. The system clearly identified the woman. The fingerprints belonged to Stephanie Cooper, an American woman who had gone missing 8 years ago. According to official data from U.S. authorities, the probability that she was alive was 0, and her case had long since been closed. The incredible circumstances under which the young woman had ended up more than 5,000 miles away, on another continent, became an unprecedented mystery. The identification alert instantly put federal law enforcement on high alert. At 6 o'clock in the morning, a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Paris received orders to fly to Marseille. When the American federal agent entered the intensive care unit, he did not see the confident analyst from the photographs in the criminal case. Sitting on the bed was a gray-haired, broken woman, convulsively clutching the edge of the blanket. The agent slowly approached, trying not to startle her with any sudden movements. It was at that very moment that Stephanie broke her absolute silence for the first time in 8 long years. She didn't ask for water or inquire about which city she was in. Her chapped lips moved almost imperceptibly, and the police officer recorded in his report the single phrase she whispered, her eyes wide with horror, staring into the emptiness of the hallway, as if invisible death were already following in her footsteps. Friends, before we dive into the darkest details of this perfect crime, I have a small request for you. Please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and like this video. It's thanks to your engagement that YouTube's algorithms recognize that the content is worth watching and promoted. This will help our channel grow, and many more people will be able to watch this story. Thank you for your support. And now, let's get back to the investigation. To understand the mechanics of this flawless kidnapping, federal agents were forced to conduct a retroactive investigation, going back to the year 2014. An analysis of the dataset and client database of the consulting firm where Stephanie worked led the detectives to one name: Marcus Drake. According to the transcripts of interviews with Stephanie's colleagues, the 35-year-old Drake was a completely unremarkable man whom no one took seriously. However, his quiet, pathological obsession with the young analyst had gone unnoticed for years behind the facade of ordinary business interactions. Drake's servers and personal records, seized later, revealed the terrifying extent of his preparation for the crime. Investigative documents show that he spent 11 months meticulously studying her habits. In his hidden computer files, investigators found hundreds of digital photographs, detailed maps of her morning routes, printouts with exact distances in miles, and an in-depth analysis of the time she spent on each section of her run. Marcus knew exactly at what moments she would be completely alone on the secluded trails of Discovery Park. He had calculated her schedule to within 15 seconds. A reconstruction of the events of that foggy October morning revealed exactly how this invisible predator operated. Drake had arrived at the park early, using fake license plates on his unremarkable van. He waited for her at the very same blind turn, a narrow section of the trail where centuries-old conifers formed a dense, natural tunnel, completely hidden from prying eyes and the lenses of police surveillance cameras. When Stephanie ran past him, he acted without hesitation. Forensic experts determined that Drake had used an extremely potent medical sedative, typically used for general anesthesia in surgery. A single, precise injection using a special pneumatic syringe immobilized the girl in a matter of seconds. The drug instantly paralyzed her nervous system, leaving her no chance to resist, scream, or put up even the slightest struggle. That is why the pulse reading on her fitness tracker, which he had carefully cut off and thrust into the cold mud, remained stable until the recording stopped completely. Drake quickly carried the unconscious body to his van, parked a few dozen yards from the trail. But the abduction from the woods was only the first stage of his diabolical plan. Drake had extensive connections in the logistics business and secretly owned a stake in a company engaged in international maritime transport. He had prepared the perfect escape route in advance, one that was absolutely impossible to track using standard Washington State Police protocols. While the Seattle Police Department was mobilizing volunteers, setting up a command center, and combing through the park's dense woods, an unconscious Stephanie was already inside a 40-foot steel shipping container. This container had been modified in advance. Its interior had been lined with dense soundproofing materials and equipped with a self-contained ventilation system and a makeshift medical unit. Customs records confirm that the cargo passed inspection using forged shipping documents and was legally loaded aboard a massive cargo ship. That same evening, the ship cast off from the Seattle docks and set sail into open waters, heading across the ocean. The woman spent long weeks of continuous transit across the Atlantic in a deep chemical stupor. Marcus had hooked her up to automatic IV drips that methodically administered sedative solutions, maintaining her basic vital functions but preventing her from regaining consciousness. Drake had thought everything through down to the smallest detail. His true goal was not simply to kidnap her physical body or demand $1 million ransom from her family. He intended to create his own reality and erase her past life forever. The ocean waves methodically rocked the ship, carrying the massive steel container farther and farther from the shores of the United States, toward an isolated location whose existence was unknown to any intelligence agency in the world. When the effects of the heavy drugs finally began to wear off, Stephanie slowly opened her eyes, not yet realizing that the air around her no longer smelled of salt and pine needles, and that a muffled, dead silence echoed from behind the thick metal walls. On November 27, 2014, at 3:15 a.m., the effects of the powerful drugs in Stephanie's blood finally wore off. According to the criminal case file, her first sensation was a piercing chill. The temperature barely reached 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The woman opened her eyes and saw a rough stone vaulted ceiling. She no longer felt the rocking of the ocean waves. The air had a distinct smell of dust and dampness. Stephanie tried to sit up, but her muscles, partially atrophied after 6 weeks in a coma, refused to obey. The building is referred to in police reports as Villa de Roche. It is a massive, completely isolated structure hidden in the coniferous forests near Mercantour National Park in the French Alps at an elevation of over 4,000 feet. The nearest settlement was 45 miles away, accessible only via dangerous mountain switchbacks. Investigators were struck by the level of paranoid security measures. All the windows of the house were tightly sealed with steel shutters, firmly welded to the frames. The doors were reinforced with metal plates and equipped with electronic locks. Only Marcus Drake knew the 8-digit access code. This fortress had no weak points. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Stephanie heard footsteps for the first time. The metal bolt clicked, the door opened, and Drake entered the room. In her testimony, the girl recalled that he did not look like a dangerous criminal. He was neatly dressed and spoke in a calm, measured tone, which made the situation even more surreal. Drake brought her a tray with water and a hot meal. It was at that very moment, on the morning of November 27, 2014, that the most brutal phase of his carefully crafted plan began: psychological terror. Marcus sat down across from the bed and delivered the news that would destroy her past life forever. According to the reconstruction, the kidnapper did not threaten her with physical force. He used the most terrifying weapon of all: disinformation. In a quiet voice, he told her that a global collapse had occurred in the United States of America, which had escalated into a bloody coup d'etat. To reinforce the illusion, he placed a stack of papers on the table. They were skillfully forged printouts of well-known American newspapers. Forensic experts would later confirm their impeccable quality. Perfect layout, fonts copied from the publications, and realistic photographs of burning cities generated using professional software. The dates on the printouts indicated that the catastrophe was unfolding while she was unconscious. Headlines from November 3, 2014 reported that Seattle lay in ruins following a series of large-scale terrorist attacks. An article from November 10th reported that anarchy had gripped the country and that looters were controlling the streets. The most painful blow was a fabricated obituary from November 15th. It listed the victims of a mass shooting, including the names of Stephanie's parents and sister. Marcus watched silently as she read those terrifying lines. Drake portrayed himself as her sole savior. In digital diaries, which would later become physical evidence, he recorded in detail how he had induced Stockholm Syndrome in her. He constantly repeated that the outside world was dead. He claimed he had risked his life to rescue her from the chaos. Marcus convinced her that if she dared to go outside or break the steel shutters, she would face certain death at the hands of feral people prowling the woods in search of new victims. Day after day, this physical prison of stone and steel was reinforced by an impenetrable psychological wall. The kidnapper explained the sound of the mountain wind outside the windows as a sign of approaching danger. He attributed the lack of food to supply disruptions caused by the destroyed infrastructure of a world that no longer existed. Stephanie, whose analytical mind was accustomed to dealing with facts, found herself trapped in a perfectly constructed web of lies. The printed words on the fake pages were so convincing and the details of her hometown's destruction so realistic that her drug-addled brain refused to look for logical inconsistencies. At 7:45 a.m., Marcus got up, gathered the empty dishes, and headed for the door. He left her the newspaper printouts and a single dim lamp that cast dark shadows on the stone floor. Stephanie stared blankly at the door when she heard an icy, metallic sound. The electronic lock clicked loudly, followed by the heavy grinding of the massive exterior bolt as it dropped into place. Sitting on the bed in complete isolation, clutching the newspaper listing the names of the deceased family, she realized something horrifying. These locks had been installed here not to forcibly keep her inside, but to keep out the nightmare of the outside world, which had just taken deep root in her own mind. According to official psychiatric evaluations by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, conducted immediately after her release, the period from 2018 to 2021 marked a time of slow but mathematically precise and inevitable personality disintegration for Stephanie Cooper. On April 3, 2018, at 7:15 a.m., she stopped marking the days with a nail on the wall of her room. Forensic psychologists, in their detailed reports, refer to this moment as the final point of no return. Under conditions of complete sensory deprivation, a chronic lack of natural sunlight, and total physical control, her will was broken. She gave in and began to sincerely believe in the false, apocalyptic reality that her abductor had skillfully constructed day after day. Criminal investigators, examining the seized personal diaries of Marcus Drake, discovered a detailed schedule by which the captive lived. He had established a strict, almost barracks-like regimen in the house, reminiscent of the rules in maximum security prisons. Every day, at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, a loud, piercing alarm sounded. Stephanie had exactly 10 minutes to get up, put on a gray, shapeless uniform made of coarse cotton, and begin her arduous household chores. Cleaning the more than 2,500 square-foot premises was physically exhausting for her. She was allowed to read only books strictly selected by Marcus, mostly old medical reference books, technical encyclopedias, and guides to survival in extreme conditions. These materials only reinforced her belief in the myth of a ruined world. The temperature inside the stone house never rose above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which kept her exhausted body in a state of constant physiological stress. Drake demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience. Interrogation records document at least 12 instances of brutal punishment for the slightest expression of doubt regarding his words or violation of established rules. The most severe documented incident occurred on November 22, 2019. At 12:30 p.m. that day, Stephanie dared to ask why the old radio receiver, which Marcus allegedly used to intercept police frequencies, had been unplugged, yet continued to emit static. Drake's reaction was swift and brutal. According to the victim, he roughly grabbed her by the arms, tightly fastened thick plastic ties around her wrists, threw her to the floor, and forcibly dragged her down the stairs to the basement. It was a soundproof underground room, no larger than 100 square feet, with no ventilation shafts or light sources. Stephanie was locked in there without food or water. According to a medical reconstruction of the events, she spent exactly 96 hours in complete darkness. The temperature of the damp stone floor was barely 45 degrees Fahrenheit. When, at 1:15 p.m. on November 26th, Marcus finally opened the massive metal door, the woman no longer had the strength to stand up. She had lost more than 5 pounds during those days. This inhuman ordeal had completely stifled any attempt at critical thinking. Her initial fear of the dark basement had become 1,000 times stronger than her desire to uncover the truth. Over time, Stephanie stopped identifying herself as a successful American, an ambitious financial analyst with a loving family on the west coast of the United States. Her past life had been completely erased, dissolved in the acid of learned helplessness. Her world had shrunk to the cold stone walls of Villa de Roche. Psychologists' records indicate that Marcus openly relished this absolute power over a living person. He had created an isolated microcosm where he was, for her, simultaneously the sole god, executioner, and savior. He regularly drove his black SUV to the nearest towns to stock up on supplies. According to receipts and GPS data, his routes led to French towns located 50 miles from the hideout. Every time he left the house, he put on an elaborate dramatic performance for her. He would put on a heavy Kevlar bulletproof vest, ostentatiously load a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, and order Stephanie to sit on the floor without making a sound. He claimed that gangs of armed marauders were constantly prowling the woods within a 20-mile radius of their hideout. And she obediently stayed put, even when the heavy front door slammed shut, locking itself securely, and the sound of the car's engine faded into the mountain air, leaving her in absolute solitude for dozens of hours. She made no attempt to break into the electronic panels, no attempts to break through the armored steel shutters. She sat on the cold tiled floor, paralyzed by an imagined, but no less real, fear of the outside world. The distortion of her mind had reached the stage where physical shackles were no longer necessary. They had been reliably replaced by psychological ones. On March 8, 2021, at 5:40 p.m., Marcus returned from yet another long trip. He closed the armored door and smiled smugly upon seeing Stephanie in the corner, paralyzed by terror at a mythical threat. His system of manipulation was working flawlessly. Not a single living soul could break through the wall of this perfect illusion. Marcus didn't even suspect that his absolute confidence in his own genius and total control had already turned into fatal overconfidence. He did not know that very soon, one small detail, seemingly insignificant at first glance, that he had accidentally brought with him from the real world, would cause this impenetrable empire of fear to crack at the seams. On October 29, 2022, at 9:15 a.m., the mechanism of the perfect crime suffered a fatal crack. In the criminal case files, this episode is classified as a critical error on the part of the perpetrator. Marcus Drake, who for 8 long years had wielded absolute power over Stephanie Cooper's life, finally let his guard down. Years of complete impunity had dulled his paranoid caution. He had grown accustomed to feeling like a god within the walls of Villa de Roche, forgetting that even the most perfect system of control is vulnerable to chance. That morning, Drake was preparing for another logistics mission. At 9:30 a.m., he put on his jacket and headed for the exit. The day before, while filling up his car at a gas station 40 miles from home, he had absent-mindedly bought the latest issue of the French newspaper Le Figaro. This was a violation of his own security protocols. As he buttoned his jacket in the dimly lit hallway, he didn't notice the folded-in 4 piece of paper slip out of his deep pocket and fall silently onto the stone floor. At 9:45 a.m., the muffled sound of an electronic lock clicked. Marcus had cut the house off from the world for at least 10 hours. 11 o'clock in the morning. Stephanie, going about her routine, was walking down the hallway. Her gaze happened to fall on a white object in the corner. According to testimony she gave to agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, she initially felt panic, assuming it was yet another test of obedience. But human curiosity proved stronger than her ingrained fear. She picked up the piece of paper. It was a real, unedited newspaper. Despite years of total brainwashing and severe sensory deprivation, her once brilliant analytical mind kicked in reflexively. The date in the upper corner read October 28th, 2022. The woman began to read. The pages covered everyday world news. The results of European sports matches, stock market indices, fluctuations in the global economy, and weather forecasts for major cities. There was no mention in the text of a government coup, the destruction of U.S. infrastructure, or gangs of looters. The world hadn't gone up in flames amid anarchy. It carried on day by day while she rotted in a stone sack. At 12:15 p.m., the realization that the last 8 years of her life had been built on a terrible lie acted as a detonator. Cognitive dissonance shattered her psychological shackles in a matter of seconds. In the soul of a woman who had lived for years in a state of absolute submission, primal rage suddenly flared up. In an instant, this rage pierced through the thick armor of learned helplessness, burning away her fear of the mythical outside world. Now she feared only one thing: staying here. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Stephanie sprang into action. The front door was electronically locked, but in the living room there was a massive glass door leading to the inner courtyard. Marcus had claimed that it was multi-layered bulletproof glass, capable of withstanding a rifle shot, and impossible to break by hand. Stephanie grabbed a heavy cast-iron mantelpiece from the fireplace, weighing over 20 pounds. At 1:20 p.m., she delivered the first blow. The glass merely trembled faintly, but she had become a machine, driven by adrenaline and pent-up hatred. She struck the same spot methodically, time and again, putting her full weight into every blow. The process of breaking through the barrier dragged on for hours. At 2:45 p.m., the first fine web of cracks appeared on the glass. At 3:30 p.m., the recoil from the blows became so strong that the cast-iron handle tore the skin off her palms. Blood poured from her fingers, dripping onto the floor, but the sharp physical pain only intensified her rage. At 4:15 p.m., the inner layer of the bulletproof glass could no longer withstand the structural stress and shattered into sharp shards with a deafening crack, cutting her face and hands. The opening that formed was large enough to squeeze through. Stephanie pushed aside the blood-stained cast-iron post. She was breathing heavily as she stood amid the glass. Cold mountain air instantly rushed into the room from outside. For the first time in 8 years, she felt the real wind on her bloodied face. The path to the outside was clear. But there was critically little time left before Marcus's SUV returned, and dozens of miles of unknown wild forest lay ahead. On October 29, 2022, at 4:20 p.m., Stephanie Cooper took her first step outside her stone prison. According to the police investigation report, it was at that very moment that an ordeal began that pushed her to the very limits of human endurance. Wearing nothing but a thin cotton shirt and rough men's pants, the woman found herself in the icy, inhospitable forests of the French Alps. She had no topographic map, no compass, and no food supplies. Her only guide was the setting sun, which she used to try to stay headed south, desperately moving away from Villa de Roche. The temperature in the mountain air was dropping rapidly. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the thermometer had dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Stephanie stubbornly made her way through sharp, rocky gorges and thick underbrush, which tore at her clothes and left deep scratches on her exposed skin. Her progress was constantly slowed by extreme physical exhaustion. 8 years of isolation in a confined space without adequate physical activity had taken its toll. Her muscles refused to function properly. At 7:30 p.m., when the mountain forest was engulfed in total darkness, she collapsed from utter exhaustion. She spent the night of October 29th and 30th, hiding beneath the massive, upturned roots of a dead pine tree. Later, forensic investigators would find this eerie spot by following traces of dried blood on the leaves. That night, became the epicenter of her brutal panic attacks. At the slightest crack of a dry branch or a sudden gust of wind, the woman instinctively pressed herself into the damp earth. She was absolutely certain that Marcus Drake had already returned, discovered the shattered armored glass, and unleashed his hunting dogs, following her fresh trail. October 30th, 2022, had turned into a non-stop marathon. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Stephanie resumed her trek. She drank ice-cold water from mountain streams, dipping her face directly into the rushing current. Every yard she covered came at the cost of incredible pain. Her feet, clad in rough work boots several sizes too big, were covered in deep, bloody blisters. For the next 48 hours, she walked almost non-stop, stumbling and falling, but stubbornly pushing through the forest. On November 1st, 2022, at 5:45 p.m., on the verge of losing consciousness, Stephanie miraculously emerged from the forest. The busy A50 highway stretched out before her. Police reports document the testimony of two drivers who were passing through that section at 6:15 p.m. They told investigators that they had seen a strange figure on the shoulder of the road, but its eerie appearance frightened them. No one stopped. Cars sped past at breakneck speed, leaving her completely alone. Realizing that no one would help her on the open highway, Stephanie hid in the thick roadside bushes. At 9:30 p.m., a commercial truck pulled into a nearby parking lot. The driver left the cab, and under cover of night, the woman was able to slip unnoticed into the half-open cargo bed, which was headed south. The journey, in total darkness, amid empty wooden pallets, proved to be a fatal blow to her already weakened body. The temperature in the open cargo bed dropped to 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Stephanie was shaking with severe chills. Doctors would later determine that it was during these hours that she began to rapidly develop severe bilateral pneumonia. The woman periodically lost consciousness, falling into a feverish delirium and losing all sense of time. On November 2nd, 2022, at 10 a.m., the truck made a lengthy stop on the outskirts of Marseille. The woman, gasping for breath due to pneumonia and immense stress, slipped unnoticed from the truck bed onto the dirty asphalt. For the next 14 hours, she wandered aimlessly through the bustling streets. The crowds of people and the roar of engines triggered uncontrollable panic in her. 11:40 p.m. Disoriented, Stephanie made her way to the Gare de Marseille-Saint-Charles train station. Her physical strength had finally abandoned her. She collapsed heavily onto the pavement, pressed her back against the cold wall, wrapped her arms around her knees, and closed her eyes, preparing for her inevitable death. Through the haze of her fever, she suddenly heard heavy footsteps approaching her with confidence. They stopped exactly an inch from her battered shoes. Stephanie shrank back convulsively in terror, absolutely certain that the predator had finally caught up with his prey. She held her breath, awaiting the fatal blow, when suddenly a voice rang out above her. The climax of this dramatic story unfolded in the wards of Timon Hospital under the strict supervision of an international investigative committee. On November 3rd, 2022, at 2 p.m., special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, together with French detectives, began the grueling process of questioning. The situation was complicated by the fact that Stephanie Cooper was in a state of severe psychological shock, and the doctors allowed them to work with her for no more than 20 minutes per hour. According to the official investigation records, the investigators pieced together her testimony bit by bit. Stephanie could not recall the names of towns or exact coordinates, but her analytical mind had retained specific landmarks: the height of the mountain range outside the window, the direction of the morning shadows, the distinct scent of pine needles, and the distinctive features of the mansion's carved stone architecture. On November 4th at 6 p.m., a French intelligence center, by cross-referencing her descriptions with satellite imagery and property records, calculated the exact coordinates of Villa des Roches. On November 5th, 2022, at 5:15 a.m., an elite unit of the French Special Forces carried out a raid. Armored vehicles blocked all exits from the property, and the soldiers stormed the mansion, blowing open the heavy doors with explosive charges. However, inside, only emptiness awaited them. A forensic examination of the premises revealed that Marcus Drake had discovered his captive's escape on October 30th, 2022, at 6 p.m., when he returned from a trip. Upon seeing the glass shattered by the fireplace mantel and the bloodstains, he acted immediately. The criminal destroyed most of the hard drives, took the cash, and vanished without a trace before the police could identify the victim. However, in the study, investigators found physical evidence that shocked even experienced agents. On the desk lay hundreds of color photographs of Stephanie, taken over the years while she slept. The photos were arranged in chronological order, documenting her gradual physical deterioration. Next to them lay neatly stacked piles of fake newspaper clippings, templates of printed news stories about the alleged destruction of Seattle, and detailed maps of the Alps with marked hunting routes. Marcus had left this dry archive as proof of his own total control. The celebration of their long-awaited reunion took place on November 8th, 2022, at Seattle Airport, where Stephanie was brought under the escort of a special medical team and agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Cooper family, who had believed their daughter and sister to be dead for 8 years, could not hold back their tears. However, this moment was filled with deep pain. Stephanie flinched at hugs, was afraid of loud noises, and barely recognized her own room. 8 years of inhuman isolation, chemical manipulation, and psychological terror had left indelible scars on her psyche. Currently, Stephanie lives under round-the-clock supervision by psychotherapists in a secure private residence on the West Coast. She is relearning basic skills, walking alone through city streets, interacting with strangers, using modern communication devices, and not feeling a paralyzing primal fear of open doors. Every flash of light or sudden roar of a car instantly transports her back to the cold, stone-like confines of Villa des Roches. But this story still has no resolution. Interpol has issued a red notice for Marcus Drake. Law enforcement agencies have checked dozens of his possible bank accounts, private jets, and shell companies in Panama and Switzerland. But all traces disappear on November 1st, 2022, at the port of Marseille. The man who stole 8 years of someone else's life by creating a perfect mental prison now roams the planet freely under a different name. Investigators are certain that Drake has not abandoned his pathological obsession. They know that a methodical predator who spent 11 months stalking his victim in Seattle never lets his prey go for good. And while Stephanie stares out the dark window of her home, somewhere in the world, Marcus Drake is already buying a new map, preparing his next flawless move.